Hello, everybody. My name is Liz. You probably all know me already, but this is one of the workshops that I do myself. It's not a workshop, it's a talk. So I will be passing down my gained knowledge through the years to you folks. Kind of like how when you have an older sibling that goes to college and knows everything about going to college, and then you're applying to go to college, and then they just tell you what to do, so it's much easier. Even though you could figure it out on your own, it's just easier to ask your sibling how to do it. So similar here. Everything here that I'm going to talk about is, you can find it online for free, super easily, but, I've done this, so I might as well share it with you folks who seem hopefully interested in this. But first, I'll cover the general structure of the games industry, so stuff like departments and specific career paths you can choose, and then I'll kind of cover some topics of, like, actually working in it, so, like, small team versus large team, maybe like your progression throughout your career path, and then some advice at the end that I've heard and seen about a lot. So let's get into the structure. So the gaming industry, or the games industry, it includes development, but it's not just development. So there's game development, there's game publishing, and there's game esports, essentially. So the game development group obviously focuses on development. Oh, heck yeah. And development is the creation of games, right? So that's what our workshops all do. So Unity, GameMaker, Pico 8, that's to make games. So you have stuff like gameplay engineer, 3D artist, and stuff like that. So that's what we'll be talking about today. That's what I know about. That's where I interned. But you have the publishing and esports. So publishing is, of course, all the business-related stuff. So you might have heard about, like, Activision Blizzard publishing, Microsoft publishing. They're usually large companies, and there's a lot of money that goes into stuff like marketing campaigns, stuff like distributing physical discs to, for example, GameStop for you guys to buy. And then maybe stuff like HR as well could be taken care of by a publishing company, right? And then esports is relatively new. It depends on the game, usually for very large games, right? I think a lot of esports companies are also just event planning companies, right? So you have like stuff like stadiums and people kind of work at that location, but you also have a lot of folks that work on specifically just esports and running those events, which is pretty cool. So let's jump into the development stuff. I love these two images, which I will provide these slides so you can zoom into it, but the left one is from 2023, the right one is from 2024. They're very, very similar, but this does a very awesome breakdown of the major sections and then the very specific specializations within those sections. So this includes, again, both publishing and esports on these lists, but I like to refer to them when you want to, for example, Google something, but you don't know what to Google. These are great terms to look up job postings for, to kind of browse yourself, right? But I'm not really expecting you guys to be able to read all these. This really small text. So in development stuff, these are the typical disciplines you'll find. As a note, every studio or development company has its own structure. It names its own departments differently, and sometimes you have jobs that fall into separate departments, and some companies have a specific department for that subgroup, right? But typically you'll find jobs within these sectors at most studios, right? So I'll cover them in alphabetical order. So first up we have animation. As the name suggests, it's pretty straightforward. It's everything regarding everything and everything. That's supposed to be everything and anything, but it's animating stuff. If you're working with 3D models, which a lot of AAA studios now do, you might be responsible also for rigging. So you have, like, you're working with the 3D mesh, because I'll cover later, but large teams and large studios have separate people responsible for very specific things, right? So meshes, rigging, stuff like that would fall under the animation stuff. And then sometimes you have motion capture, which could be part of the animation department. Sometimes it's its own department. Sometimes it's like a third-party studio. So again, very dependent on where you're applying. But some titles, so when I say specializations, those would be for large AAA studios. And then, like, you can find job postings with these titles. But you might have like a gameplay animator specifically. So you have the in-game animations with your animation state. So you have your idle state, you're attacking, you're jumping, and so on. And then some folks do just cinematic. So you have your cutscenes, your scripted stuff, and so on. So those don't have the states, that just has like a flow from beginning to end. And then also those folks would also just sometimes make the animations fully. So you would have like the rendering stuff, the lighting stuff, and then rendering the full cutscene and stuff like that. So some common tools. I'm not a professional in animation. I've never touched animation, but from looking at job postings, Maya and Motion Builder are common to use. So tools that use 3D models, tools that let you animate, and understanding animation state machines is helpful as well, especially for those gameplay animators. Moving on, we have art. Why is there a bar on the side? Okay. Oh, sorry about the white bar on the side. I don't know why that's there. But of course, art department refers to anything art related. And this is kind of like a big department. Sometimes you have sub-departments, like for example, 2D art, or you have 3D art or concept art, right? Most of the time there's specific teams within the art department. So again, I talked about texturing. We have VFX or particles. This would be all part of the art team. There's also technical art, which is a real cool niche thing that I don't understand, and it's so different that it's awesome. Because sometimes technical art is also listed as part of engineering. So it's this weird middle ground, but it's essentially artists / programmers that make tools to streamline the art process, right? So for example, technical artists specifically would create tools that other artists use. They might make shaders and so on. So technical artists have both art knowledge and technical knowledge as well. And which department they fall under depends on the studio, and sometimes, again, it depends on the tools very specific to the project or company that you're working at. But some other specializations that you'll find within the art department, of course, other than the ones that I mentioned, or on top of the ones that I mentioned above, some specific that might be confusing is, for example, a character artist. So that might be a little confusing, but usually that refers to a 3D modeler who makes character models. So you might also have, for example, a weapon artist, would typically refer to 3D modeling for just weapons, or a vehicle artist would make just vehicles, right? You might also have a texture artist, so just adding textures to 3D models, like sometimes it might just be a 3D modeler, sometimes they might have like, you know how sometimes they have like very hyper-realistic textures for like wood and stuff like that, so a texture artist would take care of that. You have also UI, which is also hand-in-hand with UX, but UI is the user interface, which is sometimes referred to like your heads-up display, your HUD in-game. So obviously the UI artist makes all the assets for that. And what I mentioned before is sometimes some departments, some studios split it into a separate department, like UI and UX, or user experience. So stuff like user interface and user experience sometimes is split off into its own department depending on the studio. But it's still an art. So again, art as a department covers so many different things, so it really depends on what you're interested in, but you have your kind of typical industry standards like Photoshop. You might also have like Illustrator or After Effects depending on what you're doing. For 3D, a lot of Maya, Blender, and ZBrush. And for VFX, I've actually seen a lot of portfolios online or videos online, reels showcasing people making VFX inside of Unity, inside of Unreal, using the built-in engine. So it's a lot of, obviously showcasing the stuff that you can do within your portfolio, using those tools and skills. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. Audio makes sense, sometimes called sound design, stuff like that. You have all your audio, so you have your sound effects, you have your original songs, you have sometimes maybe like going out and finding songs to license to put into your game. From what I found online, or just, I don't know, listening to stuff, is it's a lot of contract work, so you're working to make the music for that specific game rather than working in the studio at all times. obviously you will have in-house people in any studio, but it's kind of rare, right? So I believe, for example, Mick Gordon made all the music for Doom, but he doesn't work for the studio that makes Doom. I forget who. I think it's id. But he just kind of works for various studios, right, on a contract, which is pretty cool. But then they have flexibility to work on various things. And obviously folks who pursue audio can make it for TV and movies and stuff like that as well. There's audio designers and audio engineers. I don't know the difference. I'm very sorry. I'm not an audio person. From what I understand, an audio engineer is very similar to a designer, but they also have some technical knowledge, because essentially anything in a video game comes down to implementing it into the game engine. So if you're able to do both creating the sound and then putting it into the game to make it work properly, like that's always a big plus. So same thing with art, right? So those technical artists would make stuff and then put it into the game because they know how to. But from, again, reading job postings, you have your digital, I think it's some digital something workspace, DAWs, Reaper, and so on. And then you have specific engines for game development, because a lot of game development audio is not just one song and done. It has like layers depending on what you're doing. So Wise and Fmod. And then visual scripting. So again, knowing some of that technical know-how. Awesome. Then we have a design or game design. So a lot of folks that I kind of talk to might not understand fully what design is. So designing obviously refers to anything in the game, but it's essentially choosing what to make and how it works, right? So it's about why something works and how something works, but you're not the one that's putting it into the game. So in a way, design kind of comes early in the process, because they're the people that are like, okay, we're gonna do this, this, and this, and then those tasks get delegated to everybody else and polished up. Design, obviously, because of that, because it touches on everything in the game, covers a lot of different fields that needs decisions made. So you have your gameplay, you have your different levels and those layouts. You have combat, stuff like systems, which systems refer to, health, mana, experience. And then sometimes you have niche ones like economy design, if you have something that's very, like a tycoon game maybe. And so some of those specializations, for example, a level designer, very different from a game designer. So a game designer would be somewhat more general and be like, okay, let me design this specific weapon, this specific character, let me design this and that. A level designer would work with the map, a chunk of a map, a specific level, and depending on the game, like it's sometimes more serious than others. So like if it's some sort of open world game where it's very casual, then a level designer would have different focuses and different tasks than a level designer who works on a competitive game, right? So think of a level designer for example, Valorant or CSGO, where you have these corners that you peek, and even moving a box like 2 inches to the left would affect the competitive integrity of that map. And so these level designers take into consideration of like, okay, not only like player movement, player flow, where you can look, where enemies spawn, where you respawn. I'm sure you guys might have played a game that's like a deathmatch game where you respawn and instantly die because the enemy's right behind you. A level designer takes care of stuff like that. On the other hand, you also have a systems designer. So, for example, systems are health, mana, experience, gear, when you get the gear and stuff like that. And so essentially a systems designer looks at all the systems in the game and balances things out, makes sure that they interact with one another properly, and so on and so forth. So as you could tell, a systems designer and a level designer are pretty differently skilled, right? But at its core, it's the same thing. I mentioned before UI, user interfaces, under the art department. There's also user experience under design, because a UX designer designs the user experience, which is kind of like what you do, like your menus and how to start the game, what happens after the game is over, even sometimes within the game of like, is there anything quality of life that we can do to make playing the game more fun? So these are technically designers, and then UI artists would often make those user interfaces that the designers would place on screen. And so again, sometimes you have a UI UX department or a UI UX designer specifically as well. And I know for other departments, I've been listing some tools that you guys can like go ahead and learn and look up online. For design, it's like you can't really say exactly like go learn this thing, right? So again, what I mentioned before is level designers, if it's a 3D space, you would want to know how to use a 3D editor. But a designer is in charge of making the game fun, right? So you can have really cool art, you can have excellent programming, you can have really cool audio, but if the design of the game is not fun, then the game is not fun, right? And so you can't really learn a tool or do an online course or take a diploma and be good at design. So it's a lot of experience and iteration. Design is a very iterative process. So you do something, you see if it works, you see why it doesn't work, you make it better, you get feedback, and so on. It's very cyclical. So if you're trying to pursue design and you want something on your portfolio to showcase your design skills, I would say a big thing would be to document those iterations. So you make something, you play test it, you write down exactly what works, what doesn't, and then how you changed it, what the effects are, and so on. So you can write down, for example, you have your mom playtest the game and she gives you feedback, so you write it down in your little portfolio, and so then you would have some sort of PDF or maybe like your GitHub repo showcasing those steps and then the final result of how you design that. And I think a really awesome quote to summarize design is from my manager during my summer internship is fail fast, find fun. That's the core of it. Is there anybody here interested in design that has any questions regarding that?
So at your time at Trail, did you meet any systems designers or people that would, deal with the balance of code?
Technically, I was a systems design intern. Systems design also has like different categories in a way. In terms of you're thinking like game balance, in terms of like how much damage a gun does and stuff like that. That would be specifically a combat designer, which is kind of a very specific niche of a systems designer. And I think he was just one guy, and he kind of did everything. And he was he worked there for a long time. I forget his name, but he's been there for a while, and he knows his stuff, and he would make sure that everything is good and stuff like that.
Were you able to see what his work environment was like?
Lots of spreadsheets.
Yeah, maybe had all the stats of every weapon on him on hand. Was he meticulously looking through them all one by one, trying to make sure that they're all balanced?
Yeah. So it's a lot of spreadsheets and seeing all the stats, seeing what gun fills what niche. So you have your, for example, a low rate of fire but high damage type of rifle. You have guns that spray but are inaccurate. So those type of niches, those play styles. And then the cool thing about having a very big development studio and lots of players, lots of data, is you can pull data of okay, how many matches are played, how many of this specific situation happens, right? Because you can have people that complain on Twitter that this gun is broken, but if a specific situation where it feels unfair happens 3% of the time, and then you have millions of other players that are it's fine, then you actually don't have to tweak anything, right? So it's they're also able to pull data and request data or summaries to see if there needs to be a rebalance or not. Make sense? Awesome. Okay. Then engineering. Also sometimes called programming or coding, depending on the studio. But obviously this is implementing everything into the game. So all the other studios, departments, all the other departments make a bunch of stuff that designers tell you what they want and how it works. And then the engineers are like, awesome, let's make it work. Also, I didn't write it down, but they're doing bug fixing half the time, which is awesome. So obviously, there's a bunch of different specializations depending on what you're programming, but also sometimes studios make their own game engines, which is pretty crazy. So a lot of smaller studios use Unity, Unreal, you might have heard those, but there's a lot of proprietary engines. You might have heard of Frostbite. I know Call of Duty uses its own engine. And so you have to have people that make the game engine. So, for example, a core engineer or a graphics engineer. You can look into those if you want. Those would be more specific for if you're doing something proprietary. And sometimes engineers are embedded into the team that they're programming for, because again, everything needs to be programmed into the game at some point. So an animation programmer or an animation engineer would sometimes be part of the animation department, because then they get like direct contact with all the animation folks to see what they need, right? So some specializations, gameplay engineer, super popular. It's like the most competitive job to get, I think, or at least I know in the engineering side of things, because the gameplay engineering team is responsible for implementing things that are the main gameplay, and that the game designers are like, this is what we want in the game. So a gameplay engineer would like implement the boss fight, or implement the game mode, or they would implement your weapons to make sure that your weapons all work properly and stuff like that. So in a way, you're working directly on the main game, quote unquote, or that's what people expect when they think of, I want to make games as a job, is being a gameplay engineer. Hence, it's a very competitive job to get into. But as you can see on the rest of my slides, there's a lot of other jobs that don't require gameplay engineering. Another one, for example, is tools engineering. So again, if you're working on in a large studio, proprietary engine, sometimes they make their own tools, or they make their own kind of plugins for tools. So I know a lot of studios that use, for example, Unreal or Unity. They make their own little plugins that are still proprietary, so that the game still feels not like it's made by Unity, not like it's made by Unreal. So the tools engineers would make things that other people use, which is pretty cool. And then you have sometimes like online engineers, back-end engineers, online service engineers. They have lots of different titles, but essentially if you have any sort of online mode, online multiplayer, or like even like a social club type of thing inside of the game, where you can like make clans or whatever, or you have like party chat and stuff like that. These are the guys that take care of that. So they make sure that there's like no lag, everything's all good and smooth, stuff doesn't get hacked, whatever. So yeah, there's a bunch of other ones. So these are not all of them. Like, sometimes you have like AI engineering. So if you sometimes see AI engineer, that's not AI in terms of ChatGPT. That's AI in terms of artificial intelligence, as in NPCs, as in boss fights, stuff like that, which you can look by seeing the job posting. Again, the other tools that I list here are very dependent on the specialization that you're interested in, but some common ones that I see a lot, the most common one is C++. So it's kind of awesome, because if you're going into the tech industry, you won't really be using C++. It's like a lot of Java, Python, C maybe. So C++ is not really used in the tech industry, but it's used almost everywhere in games. And because you need both low-level and multi-threading for games, right? Because you're using all those GPU threads, you're using all those CPU threads, you're making stuff fast and efficient. So that's why you need to know your pointers, your memory. You need to know multi-threading and parallel programming and stuff like that. And C++ lets you do that. C++ is also object-oriented, which makes sense for gameplay and games, because everything is a class, everything is an object, right? But again, you can find other job postings that might have different requirements depending on what you're doing. So again, for example, online engineering, you would need to know all about online services, so like Amazon Web Services, right? AWS. You would need to know how to do that, use that for online engineering. Any questions on this? Awesome. Last major section, or major discipline, the white bar is back, is production, which you'll see. So essentially production is making sure that the game is being developed and it's being made and it runs on a schedule and is released on time. So if there's ever a delay, it's because production says we need a delay because we can't ship this on time. And sometimes also games crash and burn because of production, so whoop-de-doo. But essentially they work together with all the departments to see what's on track, what needs to get done. They kind of delegate tasks. They talk to director level or lead level people. They're like, hey, your team needs to get this done by this day. And then those leads assign it to specific people. So it's kind of like you hand it to, in a general sense, and then they assign it. I would say typically production as like a department in game development is present in a large studio because these are basically people telling people what to do and when to get it done by, which you don't quite need if it's a smaller team because they kind of handle it themselves. So there's not too many specializations. There's producer / project manager. I don't know the difference. I'm not a producer. But I think these are used interchangeably, and companies just kind of choose one or the other when they put job postings online. So it's kind of like you just have to read the job description and get interviewed and ask the interviewer a bunch of questions. But they're the ones that are like, okay, who gets what tasks? How is the game going to be made on time? And is it going to be made on time, right? Whereas product managers, compared to project managers, product managers are more higher level people that are like, what are we making? What's the next game? What's popular in the business side of things? Let me crunch my numbers. Let me get my spreadsheets. Let me run some scripts and see, can we make money off of this, right? So sometimes, I don't know if you play a game, you're like, who decided on this? Because like, why is there a season pass in this game? Why is there a battle pass in this game? Maybe it was a product manager who's like, hey guys, battle passes are making a lot of money. Let's do that. Maybe. I'm not 100% sure, so. And then some useful things to know, I guess, like agile development. That's kind of used everywhere. So like you have sprints that are 2 or 3 weeks, and you gotta get something done within that sprint. And then, girl, I don't know. From what I understand, productions, like producers, you'll see a lot of those titles on like movie credits. So I'm assuming that if you're interested in production for games, it's very similar to production for a variety of other entertainment and other media, right? And I don't know if there's any tools you need. You just kind of like need to know things. So very similar to design, where you gotta like make stuff, I guess, and just get experience. But yeah, I think. Okay, I'm gonna go into the next section. But is there anything, any questions on the general structure of the industry that maybe you expected me to cover that I didn't? Everything clear so far? Awesome. So I'll cover like small, large studios, what working at those small or large studios looks like, typical career path from my observation, and then kind of the development cycle from my observation. Keep in mind that everything here is like pretty biased towards my knowledge, and so you might find something online that says that this is all wrong, and so I'll like, okay, this is what I know. So indie versus AAA. So you might see these words, you might have seen these words. It's like, oh, indie studio, indie title, AAA title. They don't have concrete definitions. So I guess you can say you work at a AAA studio, but it's like a studio that happens to make AAA games. But even then, you can't really define them. So the word indie comes from independent. So you have very small teams. They're self-funded, typically don't have a publisher. But even now, you have indie game publishers like Devolver Digital, so it's very flexible. But Celeste, Stardew Valley, and Hollow Knight are all examples of indie games. I believe they're all self-published through like Steam and stuff, and made by very small teams each. AAA, you have large developers, you have major publishers, you have production teams, and you have budgets of more than $100 million, which is pretty crazy. And then sometimes that's just development budgets, and then you have more like $200 million on top of that for marketing, like Call of Duty. So you have Call of Duty, Last of Us, League of Legends, lots of those big companies that make a lot of big money. So a lot of the AAA games that you might have heard of are just the ones that you have heard of, even if you haven't played them, you know. But again, there's no definitions. And technically, like, there's some games that you can call as AA, where they're not indie and they're not AAA. So indie would be, like, really small team, like, less than 40, less than 30 people. And then AAA is like you have 100 multi-million-dollar budgets, so anything kind of in between that is AA. So like Life is Strange, It Takes Two, PUBG would be like between 30 and 100 people, maybe between 30 and 150 people working on it. Like $50 million budget, even that's like big but not too big, right? So again, these are kind of marketing terms, but if you are interested in working at companies that make those games, I'm just going to call them small teams and large teams, and then obviously you can compare the two and figure out what's in between. So on a small team, you make quote-unquote indie games. On a large team, you have AAA games. So in between would be a AA game. On a small team, you market and distribute the game yourself as a team. So, for example, you have to buy the Steam rights. You, have devlogs, you have tech talk, and you just hope you get popular. Whereas on a large team, you have a publisher, and the publisher would take care of the marketing for you and do all those cool marketing campaigns and have like Go-Gurt, Call of Duty collabs or something like that. On a small team, you wear multiple hats, quote unquote. So essentially, a hat is referring to like your disciplines, like, oh, I'm an engineer, or I'm an artist, or sometimes it's like I'm a gameplay engineer and I'm an online services engineer. So on a small team, of course, you gotta do both of those at the same time. Whereas on a large team, you specialize in a niche discipline and you're very good at it. So if you're a gameplay engineer, you're a very, very good gameplay engineer, and that's what you kind of do as a career. On a very small team, you can actually, because you have a small budget, you can take more risks and essentially be more innovative. So you might see a lot of indie games that are like, have these really strange mechanics, like gameplay mechanics that you didn't expect to work, but they are like really fun to play with actually. Whereas on a large team, in a way, you have to play it safe for your design choices because you're putting in so much money into this game, and a lot of you have like shareholders and other companies and like firms that are giving you money for it. They're expecting a profit, and so basically you have to do things that will get you money in return. So that's why you have like 30 different Call of Duty games, and they're all pretty similar, is because hey, it works, right? We're not gonna mess with the formula too much because then suddenly we're out $100 million, which kind of sucks. And so, yeah, again, it's because like money-wise, small budget, you can kind of do whatever you want, and also small team, you can do whatever you want. Large budget, you got to be safe because you're playing with so much money. And then lastly, on a small team, your job security and how much you get paid for all the different stuff that you do really depends on how well the game sells. So it's more like volatile in a way. That's why a lot of indie projects and indie games and small studios are really passionate people that really want to make games, and that's why you have some cool stuff out there. And that's why people are like, why don't AAA studios do this? Because, well, you got to play it safe. But at the same time, if you work at a AAA studio, you're pretty secure in your job unless there's layoffs and budget cuts. But typically, you can, stick around in a company, jump from company to company, and kind of do the same thing, stay within your specialization, and progress over time. So, of course, you have that kind of AA that's in between, where you kind of have, if you compare the two, for example, you can not wear too many hats, but not specialize too much. So, for example, you can just kind of be an engineer and you kind of twiddle with some things. You have a decently sized budget, but then you can't be like too risky with your design choices. So it's kind of like you can obviously find teams that, for example, started off indie, but now have established themselves to be like a decently sized company. Like, for example, the company that made Hades. What do you guys know the name of that company?
Was involved with that?
Yeah, but no, I know because they made Hades, they made Transistor, they made
Supergiant.
Yeah, Supergiant. Thank you. Supergiant Games. I would say it's like, I guess you can call them indie at this point. They're a bit larger than indie because they've had so much success with their previous games and they really popped off with Hades. So I would say like that would be kind of like a more stable job because they've had success with Hades. And yeah, any questions on this?
Is Supergiant a good company to apply for? Are they an American studio?
I think so. I'm not sure. Honestly, anything that's not like a super duper large team, I would say is good to apply for. You can always find reviews online, but like typically the stuff that you get with like sexual harassment and discrimination and stuff like that, like I don't know why, but typically on very large companies where it's harder to spot in a way and harder to call people out on it.
They are in there.
Yeah. But then obviously the cool thing with the sucky part is that like you want to work for a cool indie studio, like oh like these guys made Hades, I want to work with them, but then everybody does.
23 employees as of last year.
Yeah. So not too small, but not too large either. Not 3 people. 23 people is pretty good size. But see, then if you want to work for them, and then a lot of people everybody else wants to work for them. Yeah. So yeah. Okay, so then I mentioned wearing multiple hats, right? And so these are just some examples of like what I mean by that. So if you work on a small team, your title might just be 3D artist, but if you're working on a large team, you might specifically be a character artist, and that's it, where you just make character models, or an environment artist, or a weapons artist, or a vehicle artist, right? If you're an engineer or a programmer, on a small team, on a large team, you might be, again, a gameplay engineer or a graphics engineer or a tools engineer, so very specific things, right? On a small team, it's pretty cool to be a game designer because you get to do so many decisions for the game, whereas on a large team, you would have specifically level designer or combat designer or systems designer and so on. And again, on a small team, you're like an animator and you kind of do a variety of things, gain experience in a variety of different animations. But on a large team, you have your like cinematics, first-person view, motion capture, and so on. Make sense? So again, small team kind of sounds cool, but then again, you got the risk of job security, which is a little scary if you're just starting out. But then you get to gain experience in a lot of different disciplines. But then you need to know you need to know what to do, which can be pretty scary because out of college, you don't know what to do. And then sometimes you have hyper specialized jobs where I would say these occur in large studios that need people to complete tasks that are very dependent on the project that they're currently working on. So you won't really have these in the industry as like a general thing. But like some that I noticed, for example, the Red Dead Redemption 2 credits for Rockstar, you have lighting artists where guess they control the lighting in the open world to make everything very pretty. I mean, if you play the game, it's a gorgeous game, so, you know. They have ambient animation content developer. I don't even know what that means, but I'm assuming they make the animations for ambient stuff. I don't even know what that means, but again, Red Dead Redemption 2, very open world, so you have a lot of moving little parts to make the game feel alive, so good for them, you know, they have roles specifically for that. Open world activities designer makes sense. The title is very straightforward, but again, you won't really have that in a Call of Duty game because it's not really open world, right? So again, project dependent. For Blizzard, I saw some credits for a camera designer, which was under that animation department. So I'm assuming that's the camera work specifically in cinematics, or the designing where the camera goes, or maybe how the camera acts. I'm not sure. It's pretty awesome. I want to know what it means. Props and interactives artist. I don't know. That's awesome. I guess it's props artist. And then a dungeon designer, which is pretty cool. So game designer, but just for the dungeons, because that's what Diablo is, baby. So again, with these very specialized jobs, you'll obviously find job postings for these. But sometimes also when studios move from project to project, you'll finish your current project. They'll see your performance of like what you did on that project, and then be like, okay, we have this one coming up next. Based on your skills, do you want to like do this or that, or stick to what you're doing so far, so forth. So for example, you're a weapon artist at Blizzard, and then you switch to Diablo 4. So they're like, well, you did these like weapons really cool. Do you want to work on props and interactives, right? So I'm sure the skills that you learn in these very specific jobs can still be applied to more general cases. Any questions on this? Okay. And so these are kind of common, I guess. Like, this is what I notice when I look at job posting sites. Because I think every industry uses different words to distinguish between different steps. But here it's typically associate, and then mid-level, then senior, then lead / principal / whatever else adjective, and then director would be like the highest step. So most of these, except for the mid-level one, would have this adjective in front of the title. So associate is your entry level between 0 and 2, roughly. Every studio defines it differently. I've seen some positions where it's like you need 3 years of experience to be associate, which is a little silly in my opinion. But it would be, for example, associate designer, right? Your mid-level positions won't use the adjective, so just, for example, I'm just a gameplay engineer means you're a mid-level engineer. So between, again, after associates, before senior, it really depends. Sometimes it's like I've seen positions like posting say you need 5 years of experience to be mid-level, which again, it really depends on the studio. But after that, of course, comes senior. You know your stuff. You've been in the industry for at least 5 years, sometimes like 6 or 7 years. As the as you progress, there's like less rigid requirements. So usually it's about these years of experience, but then also sometimes they don't even list the years anymore. It's just like, have you shipped 4 AAA games, for example? Like you've shipped 5 titles, like those types of requirements, and then like you know how to do blank, blank, and blank with confidence. I know Treyarch does this kind of a split. I'm not sure if every studio does, but from looking at job postings, it kind of seems that way, where you can kind of become a lead, where you take on managerial tasks, or you can become a principal designer or a principal, whatever. Or they might use a different adjective, like, I don't know, other adjectives, I guess. So, yeah, so you have, like, managing others as a lead, so you're managing a team, and then you work with production to manage that team and get tasks done, and you do a lot of meetings. Or you stick to your like craft, right, and you just become really good at that. So you'll still probably have a lot of meetings and like managing tasks and stuff as like a principal engineer or whatever, but you focus mostly on still implementing the stuff into the engine and stuff like that. And then you have your director level. So you have your different departments that are in the studio, and then the director is the point of contact for that specific department. So I've seen a decent amount of postings online where you first are an associate director first, and then you grow into the director. And so sometimes like you have the director and then like multiple associate directors depending on like if there's multiple paths that the department focuses on. So you might, for example, have a director of engineering, and then you have an associate director of engineering for gameplay, and then associate director of engineering for tools, for example, right? And then you have the teams under that. Most likely, or oftentimes, you're a lead, so you've already had like managerial experience, and then you eventually go to directors. And I think a lot of the directors kind of are at that company, not only in the industry for a long time, but are also at the company for a while, so they really understand where the studio's headed, right? The directors speak to the studio head and speak to like the product managers to decide on where the game is, or where the next game is headed, right? So they do a lot of cool stuff. And again, these might not be super accurate. These are kind of roughly, but at the same time, the goal here is that like you can look up online associate game engineer and understand what that means, right? Any questions on this? Awesome. Okay, and then I want to talk about the development cycle, because again, I just want to cover all the stuff that I know when it comes to working on games. So understanding the game development cycle is pretty helpful to understand, especially if you're joining a company mid-development phase. It starts with pre-production, and then the rest of the phases are technically during production. But pre-production is you're figuring out what the game is, like what genre, what the target audience is, the style maybe of it. So for example, for Riot, their pre-production for Valorant, for example, would be like, well, let's make a competitive shooter, right? That would be during pre-production. General concepts for general concept art for some of the characters, environments, and story, like again, what could this game be is pre-production. And then you create and test out a prototype, right? So again, the main point of a game is it fun to play? Do we see potential in this? And if the game is not fun to play, then the project gets scrapped and it doesn't move into production. So again, the rest of the steps are production. And these are listed in order. After it's approved and greenlit for production, it goes into pre-alpha. So those are, okay, we have an idea for what the game is, now let's decide exactly what the game is. You're adding new features in, you're cutting away features, be like, oh, what's going on? And that's pre-alpha. And usually you have like, internal play tests within the studio to figure out if it's fun or not, if you're headed in the right direction. I mean, I think rarely you have like open pre-alpha stages where other people can test it out. But then after pre-alpha, it comes alpha, which you might have heard of. Like, this game's an alpha. Essentially, it's feature complete. So all the game design decisions that the designers made are mostly implemented in the game. You can play the game from beginning to end. And some of the assets still need to be finalized and stuff. Hello. Are you here for the careers in the games industry talk?
Yeah.
Okay.
We got lost. Yeah, we might not be here for too long because we do want to post.
Okay, no worries. I'm finishing up, but I am recording this, so if you guys want the recording, there'll be a link for it later, yeah. But essentially, yeah, so if you hear that a game is in alpha, it's like, okay, it's feature complete, you can play it, but you might still have some temporary assets that need polish. And sometimes, depending on the studio, you'll have an open alpha. So it's most of the time, like, the game, the studio will select, like, maybe send out, like, a sign-up sheet, or they'll select a very small amount of players to play test and give feedback. So it's usually pretty small, but you might hear about that. And then we have beta, comes after alpha. So here in beta, you have now all the features, but also all of your assets. Everything else is implemented. It's all working properly. At this point, nothing new should be added. I mean, in an emergency, I guess you could. If it's like, oh shit, this game is terrible, we have to change everything. But here it's where you're like really polishing the game. And this is where you might have heard about like open betas, right? Because open beta comes right before launch. Where sometimes the studio opens up the open beta to anybody in the world. You can download it and play it and provide feedback. Most of the time, again, you have this sign-up process, and then they just choose more people to play test with. And a lot of the reason why you have these open alphas or open betas is to make sure that the game runs smoothly on various setups, because usually a game studio uses like the best and latest technology to create the game, right? So, for example, whenever a new console is about to come out, and like, I don't know if you guys have ever wondered, like, oh, how can this game be made as a PS5 exclusive when the PS5 just came out? Well, because they get copies of the PS5 to make the game for it, and they look really scary looking, but like they would have the latest to develop the game in-house. So obviously, if you're, for example, shipping on PC specifically too, like you need to make sure it's running on those toasters. So that's what the goal of those are. And then obviously launch, awesome. Sometimes it's called going gold because it's ready to be shipped. It passes the gold standard, and it's going gold also refers to like, oh, we're making physical copies. Like we're sending out the software to whoever makes, publisher, and they make all the cool physical copies. But oftentimes, the time between sending out and like, because making physical copies obviously takes a while, so most of the time you're still developing, and that's why most games nowadays have the day one patch or the day one hot fixes, because that's from going gold what has changed. And sadly nowadays you have much more post-launch development, because you have a GAAS, or games as a service. So anything with a season pass or a battle pass or DLCs. You have development that's dedicated for post-launch content, right? Obviously, you're going to have your patches and your hotfixes. So you have your studio, for example, For example, Rockstar making GTA 6, but you still have people that are devoted to fixing the bugs in Red Dead Redemption 2 and whatnot, right? You still get hot fixes for GTA 5, stuff like that. And of course, another chunk of your development team that's devoted to making seasons and DLC. So again, GTA 5 Online has all those like crazy seasons and patches and whatever they're called, while the other part of the team works on GTA 6, right? Any questions on the development cycle? Yeah, so of course, obviously, understanding this just kind of helps you when you are joining a new team to understand what part of the cycle you're joining into. And for example, if you're responsible for post-launch content, like, I guess, expecting that, understanding how it works, and so on. Okay. And then my last final section on advice, from just what I've experienced and talked to other folks and saw lots of YouTube channels and stuff like that, on how to prepare for the games industry. Of course, I've talked about all these different departments and disciplines and stuff like that, and all these specializations that I'm mentioning. But all the information that I'm providing for you, like for example, what tools you should learn to get started in that direction, is all through those job postings, right? Because if you read job postings and they tell you exactly what they're looking for, then you can prepare yourself to apply for those jobs, right? So these are links. I'll provide these slides, but these are 3 sites. I use Grackle the most, but these are 3 like aggregate sites that pull together a bunch of applications for you, and you can very quickly find a bunch of listings. What's up?
Are these specifically for game development?
Yes, these are specifically game development aggregate sites. So like you have LinkedIn and Indeed that you can obviously find jobs on, but those would be like any jobs, to be honest, whereas these are specifically for game development. And yes, so most of the time, depending on the department, they list specific tools, they list specific amount of years they expect for you to know. And then again, I mentioned this before, but if you're looking for specific tools, look up the associate or sometimes junior positions, because they'll list the rigid requirements compared to like a senior level role. And then another way that you can kind of play around with something is look up videos or tutorials of, this, like, oh, you're interested in this, like you can look it up online, and just kind of see what they do, what the process looks like, if it's something that interests you. And also a lot of times either in the description of the video or replying to somebody's comment, they'll tell you what they're using and you can be like, oh, let me find that. So I know, for example, I like to watch speed paints of this one artist that does the splash arts for a lot of the League skins and different character arts, so the splash arts for them, and it's pretty cool to see, like, you're like, oh, this looks done, but they're halfway through and you're like, oh my god, what else would they do? And then you script through it. So it's pretty fun. Another thing that's the biggest piece of advice I would say is to make stuff, because if you want, thanks for coming by. Again, there'll be a recording available later if you're interested. So again, making things. So if you want to make games as a job, it makes sense to make games as a hobby. So that's kind of like anybody that I talk to, any recruiter, any blank you'll look up online is like, make games and put them on your portfolio, put them on your resume, say exactly what you did, put in like concrete details and numbers if you can. And also, it doesn't have to be an actual game. Like, it doesn't have to need a story or multiple levels or a progression system with 10 different, weapons to choose from. It can be very small and very focused, so like a chunk, right? So, because the goal is to showcase your skills, right? So, for example, if you want to showcase your skill in programming enemy AI, so stuff like pathfinding or decision trees, stuff like that, then you can make a small, game where it's just one boss fight, or maybe it's just defeating 10 enemies, and then it showcases the next 10 enemies, and so you showcase 3 different types of enemies and how they behave. And it's just that. There's no menus, there's no health system, nothing crazy, because it's very focused, and then you get to talk about exactly what you did, And if, also another bonus is if you can, make these playable in the browser, or make, a GIF or a video showcasing this, it's a lot easier for a recruiter to glance over it rather than having them download the full game. So I highly recommend putting little GIFs on your portfolio site and that you have. And then for something like design or production that I mentioned that they don't have specific tools that you need to know, showcasing your process is very valuable, which I did mention during the design department section. So again, how something evolved over time and why is pretty valuable. So your thought process, right? And then lastly is obviously to stay motivated, because here at Binghamton there's nothing for game development or game design. So you will have to make things in your free time on top of your classes, or transfer to a different school, I guess, that has game development. And yeah, so it's all just about motivation and making things and wanting to make things. Here at the game development group, we offer a bunch of workshops, but if you don't come, then you can't learn, you know? And then one thing I want to mention that is prevalent, I don't know how much in other industries, but it's very much works off of passion. And I would say that that makes it a double-edged sword, because when you have passionate people making on something they really want to make, they make some really cool things, right? Especially you can see that through indie games where people have more creative freedom in what they want to make. You can see that they're like, oh, like these people loved making this, and you can feel it. But because it's a place of passion, essentially it makes it very competitive, right? Because there's only so many jobs. It sounds like a fun job compared to some other industries, so people want to do it. But then it's competitive, and then that's why you kind of get low wages, and you're not really paid for your time correctly. There's obviously a bunch of other negatives about, like, you know, overtime and overworking yourself and stuff like that. But essentially it's like you want to be an engineer, and then Ted wants to be an engineer, but Ted is willing to do the same work for less money, and Ted is going to get hired. And it just kind of sucks, because how do you fight that unless you unionize, which is like, ugh. But being passionate is like what got me my internship, even though I wasn't super qualified. So I think also another thing is, if you're able to land an interview, is definitely to practice not being nervous, or even if you are nervous, to somehow still showcase that you're passionate about being there and learning and making games, you know. And even a little bit at a time, like during spring break or winter break or summer vacation, you can like make little games. You can make games during the game jam, like this weekend, and put it on your portfolio. And I think also, if you stick around in Binghamton, the fact that you can make all these games on top of a course, like on top of your degree that has nothing to do with games, is pretty cool, you know, because again, it shows that you're passionate, because it's like, hey, I'm a full-time student studying mechanical engineering, but I also make games, you know, so it's pretty cool about that. But yeah, that's all from me. It's just me spewing everything that I know at you guys, so I hope it's helpful. I hope you learned something from it. Most importantly, I'm giving you the concrete words that you can use to Google things, because that's, I think, pretty important, as like where to start Googling things, and then you go down a rabbit hole of Googling things. And yeah, it's tough out there, so I hope you guys make it. But yeah, if there's, is there any questions for me? Awesome. Well, that's all I have, so thank you guys for coming and for listening. And yeah, I'm here if you guys want to chat after this.